Okay, today we're looking at the New Deals, which were a series of acts that were created in order to tackle the Great Depression. There were two of them, the first New Deal, which had a series of acts, and the second New Deal, which had a second group of acts. The person who was responsible for setting these up was Franklin Roosevelt. He was the one that ended up winning the election by a landslide against Hoover. And Hoover lost in part because of his poor response to the Great Depression. So what Franklin Roosevelt did is actually when he was running for election, he only actually gave kind of vague a concept of these new deals, but what didn't get into a lot of specifics. And so what he ended up doing in order to have a better handle on a series of acts and things that needed to get done is that he assembled a group of advisors that were academics from Columbia University to advise him on the economic issues that were happening in the United States, which is one of the smartest things that he did. Was to bring outside advisors that specifically had knowledge and expertise in economics to advise him on things that he didn't know as much about. And they gave him essentially, they got together and compiled this entire presentation, essentially an analysis on the Depression and how he should fix it. One of the first things that they did is that they set up that it was it was of national origin, not international. And the reason for that is that Hoover had insisted that it was an international origin problem. And they stated that no, that's not the case. It actually came from the national origin. And so that determines a lot of how you tackle the issues at hand. And then they said that the problem is that when anything is broken, or it ends up affecting everything else. And so they ended up identifying problems that were taking place that needed to be fixed. And those problems that they said needed to be looked at and addressed were that there was a lack of income in the farm sector. And so that they needed to look at restoring prices and income within the farming community. Industry prices were too rigid, meaning that it didn't have flexibility with the economy and what was going on to adjust. And then there was a failure of workers' wages to rise fast enough, which we looked at before last lecture, with how that massive disparity between the amount that was being produced and the workers' wages that weren't going up nearly as fast. And so that became a problem. So those were some of the problems. And so they said the solution, or specifically, more so than I guess the solution, what you needed to be fixed if there was going to be any type of actual solution or end to the Depression, was the banking system, specifically, and the security systems, which is with stocks. And stocks needed regulation. There needed to be more regulation on both the bank and stocks in order to control and monitor them. And then they needed to have more regulation on businesses, specifically with looking at wages and the investments that they made, as well as the making sure that they had the power to, or capacity to, produce. And so that in order to have that happen, there needed to be, again, control and monitoring abilities to do so. So this did influence his decisions with the new deals, and we'll see. We're going to go through. One of the things with this is I apologize, kind of a long list, because the new deals are a series of acts, and so in order to go through and understand what the new deals were, you have to kind of list off these different acts that were put into place, and there's several of them. So these things that his advisors set up, and we'll see, influence some of those areas that the new deals tried to target. One of the things that he did once he actually became president and got into the job, the very first thing he did was the Emergency Banking Act. And the Emergency Banking Act went hand in hand with fireside chats. So we'll talk about that one in just a minute. The Emergency Banking Act was to close down the banks and make it a bank holiday. So that, and the holiday went from March 6th through the 10th in 1933. And the whole point of this was to stop the insane flow of wealth that was being taken out, that was closing down the banks. He also halted gold transactions too. So again, the whole point was that you had all these people that were pulling out their money out of the banks, which was causing them to close and collapse. And so he needed the banks, he needed the people to not be able to pull out their money, because it was the only way that they were going to be successful in stopping the banks from all closing. And so that was the main plan. And then specifically to regulate, the act gave him the ability to regulate the banks and decide which ones would open. So that way you only opened up the banks that could be guaranteed to be successful. The banks that would fail if they reopened up were not opened up, and instead only those that they knew that they could promise that if people went and got their money out of the bank, that it would be there. And the goal then is that they'd have a safer place to put their money when the banks reopened. Now, what went with this was the fireside chats, and you really needed both to convince people to stop rushing the banks. The fireside chats was a new thing, not to what we would think of today, but it was meant to be direct access to the president through radio. And this was the first time of really utilizing this direct communication with the public. Right, we have Twitter and YouTube now, and Instagram, and anything else that gets us direct access to the president, to politicians. So that seems normal at this point, but that was not something that was around before. So it was a huge deal to have the president speaking through the radio, which families would sit around the radio, kind of like they later sat around the TV once that was common in people's households, and would listen to the president with the goal, which was to assure Americans that the banks would be safe, that they could trust the banks. And the goal, of course, being that then they wouldn't go, not only would they not remove their money, but ideally the end goal would be that deposits would start again. Because, of course, people were not depositing any money when the banks were failing. That's essentially like giving your money away at that point. And so you needed to establish confidence in the banks. And the whole point of this first fireside chat was to do that, as well as let people know what was going on. Because again, you did have the newspapers that were giving some information, but if they really wanted to know in detail what was the plan, what the president was planning on doing, what was the situation in the United States, and assure people that things were being fixed, that the government was working on it. This was extremely successful, so much so that he continued to give fireside chats periodically. Now, it wasn't all the time like what we're used to now of every single day. You're getting multiple Twitter feeds, and we're inundated with news. Like, they probably couldn't even imagine how much access we have today compared to what it used to be. So these fireside chats happened throughout his presidency, but they weren't like once a week or anything like that. It was meant to do as needed when you needed to reassure the people, and that people could, feel confident after listening to the president, as well as ideally understand and knowledgeable about what was going on. So I want us to actually listen to the first fireside chat, which talks about the Emergency Banking Act and the crisis, just to get an idea and sense of how he went about informing the Americans. And it works, because what happens is this is successful. This works. You have, when the banks open back up after the holiday, you had more deposits than you had withdrawals. So his plan worked. So we're going to listen to that now. The thing to be aware of with the audio is that it's from a radio recording, and it's it's probably recorded from the original recording, but it's very staticky. So keep in mind with the volume here for just a minute. I'm going to have the closed captioning on so you can read it too if it's hard to hear. But just keep that in mind, that it's not the best audio, and it does have quite a lot of static.
I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking, to talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, and why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds and commercial paper and mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets of a bank and convert them into cash except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all of the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday, and this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, showed by this action a devotion to public welfare and a realization of the emergency and the necessity for speed that it is difficult to match in all our history. The third stage has been the series of regulations permitting the banks to continue their functions, to take care of the distribution of food and household necessities and the payment of payroll. This bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. Remember that no sound bank is a dollar worse off than it was when it closed its doors last week. Neither is any bank which may turn out not to be in a position for immediate opening. The new law allows the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets, and thus the banks that reopen will be able to meet every legitimate call. The new currency is being sent out by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in large volume to every part of the country. It is sound currency because it is backed by actual good assets. Another question that you will ask is this: why are all the banks not to be reopened at the same time? The answer is simple, and I know you will understand it. Your government does not intend that the history of the past few years shall be repeated. We do not want and will not have another epidemic of bank failures. As a result, we start tomorrow, Monday, with the opening of banks in the 12 Federal Reserve bank cities. Those banks which on first examination by the Treasury have already been found to be all right. That will be followed on Tuesday by the resumption of all other functions by banks already found to be sound in cities where there are recognized clearinghouses. That means about 250 cities of the United States. In other words, we're moving as fast as the mechanics of the situation will allow us. On Wednesday and succeeding days, banks in smaller places all through the country will resume business, subject, of course, to the government's physical ability to complete its survey. It is necessary that the reopening of banks be extended over a period in order to permit the banks to make applications for the necessary loans, to obtain currency needed to meet their requirements, and to enable the government to make common sense checkups. Please let me make it clear to you that if your bank does not open the first day, you are by no means justified in believing that it will not open. A bank that opens on one of the subsequent days is in exactly the same status as the bank that opens tomorrow. I know that many people are worrying about state banks that are not members of the Federal Reserve System. There is no occasion for that worry. These banks can and will receive assistance from member banks and from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And, of course, they are under the immediate control of the state banking authorities. These state banks are following the same course as the national banks, except that they get their licenses to resume business from the state authorities. And these authorities have been asked by the Secretary of the Treasury to permit their good banks to open up on the same schedule as the national banks. And so I am confident that the state banking departments will be as careful as the national government in the policy relating to the opening of banks and will follow the same broad theories. It is possible that when the banks resume, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear to you that the banks will take care of all needs, except, of course, the hysterical demands of hoarders, and it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime in every part of our nation. It needs no prophet to tell you that when the people find that they can get their money, that they can get it when they want it for all legitimate purposes, the phantom of fear will soon be laid. People will again be glad to have their money where it will be safely taken care of and where they can use it conveniently at any time. I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress. The success of our whole national program depends, of course, on the cooperation of the public, on its intelligent support, and its use of a reliable system. Remember that the essential accomplishment of the new
Okay, so one of the things that he does is he lays out that here's why the banks don't have all the money available, and it actually explains a small part of how banks function. Then he talks about what they're planning on doing, and then it uses that idea of, like, I trust that you guys, will wisely, make the right decision, and that, you will go ahead and realize that the banks we're opening are trustworthy. And then he says that, well, a few people might not have confidence and try to withdraw their money. Most, smart people, good citizens won't. And then also that hoarding has become unfashionable. So the idea of putting on this idea of making you feel bad if you go do that when the banks reopen. But then also trying to make clear that except for crazy demands with the hoarding stuff, that if someone comes to get the money will be there. And once people realize that's sound, the panic will stop. And this was very successful. It calmed people down. They enjoyed having themselves being directly talked to by the president and explaining in detail, this is what we're doing. This is the plan for going forward, and we're guaranteeing that the banks that open will be secure. And even if your bank doesn't open the first day, most will eventually be reopened. There were a few that didn't, but a lot that did. And that once yours does reopen, it will be just as sound as the federal banks, because of course there was issues and fears with the idea that federal banks might be okay, but the smaller state banks and local community banks wouldn't hold up. And he's saying, no, if a bank is opening up, we're backing it. And so this was incredibly successful. It calmed people down. Like I said, when they reopened after the holiday, they had more deposits than withdrawals for the first time in a very long time. And even saying, the bank is more secure than under your mattress, which is where a lot of people started storing their money, was under their mattress. And this was a very scarring thing for people. There were lots of people that, into their old age, that continued to not trust the banks. And while most did and began reusing the banks, there were always some people that it may have used the banks, but always kept a good chunk of money under their mattress or hidden in their house somewhere. It's occasionally where you hear stories, not so much anymore, but where you used to hear stories of people finding hidden money when they were renovating a house that they bought. because someone had stashed money in the house for safekeeping from fear of that. Another psychological impact of the Great Depression is that you had a lot of cases of people, especially kids that were kids during the Great Depression, that experienced that hardship and lack of food and supplies, that ended up being hoarders, not of the money, but like of stuff. Like they couldn't throw out stuff because there was this innate need to put it to use in some way, even if they never did. And so it really had a psychological impact on people. Again, especially younger kids that grew up during that period and experienced extreme hardship, ended up having some of those issues for the rest of their life because of that anxiety that it created when they were younger. All right, so what we're going to look at now then is the series of acts in the first New Deal. And we're going to go through and kind of list and briefly explain what each of those were. So the very first was the Emergency Banking Act, but then you have the Economy Act. And the Economy Act was unique because this was actually done to fulfill a campaign promise that Roosevelt had made, which was to cut federal spending. He had criticized the federal spending and budget, and so this Economy Act was one of the only New Deal acts that actually cut spending. All the other New Deal acts increased federal spending, and this one was specifically meant to try to say he'd fulfilled a campaign promise. Not that it was helpful or beneficial, but that's why this was kind of a weird one in there. It ended up veteran pensions were cut in half, and so were salaries of federal government employees. And this way he could say that he cut federal spending in some ways. So federal government employees' salaries. The next one was the Beer Act. And the Beer Act ended prohibition. So, right, you had in the 1920s, you had prohibition that had come around, and we looked at this, the steps where it showed the woman and child with her head in her hand holding her child looking distraught, and it was the steps of drinking, right, where it's a social drink, to where it turns to fighting, to where it turns to destitution, and then eventually suicide. And there had been a huge push, in part connected to what we talked about with the cult of domesticity and protecting the home and all of that, and women who were looking for changes in reform to prohibit alcohol. And prohibition then was put in as an amendment, and was a successful push in large part because of women as well as conservative and Christian groups. Not surprisingly then, just like the Great Depression had ended made birth control legal because of a necessity, and prohibition was never popular. But they ended prohibition officially in the New Deal because, of course, the idea was the sales tax on beer could go to supplement the cost of other New Deals. And it would also be something that was popular for people. Right, and in hard times, drinking was seen as more a necessity, something that people could look to, and it was one of those that he would get a positive response to as well. But specifically, the sales tax on the beer is what they were looking for, because that money could be used for other aspects. The next one is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and this one was looking at restoring farm income, and trying to end the surpluses of crops, right? Remember, we talked about the fact that it actually costs farmers to harvest their food because prices were so cheap. And so this was tackling that idea. And they specifically, in the Agricultural Adjustment Act, paid farmers not to grow crops, grow or harvest crops. And that way, the idea with what would happen is that you would have more of a demand for those goods, whether that was grain or vegetables or whatever. And so this would cause the price to go up. And this would help farmers specifically in being able to actually farm again and make money off of that, and hopefully end some of the destitution that farmers had seen because of the fact that for most crops they couldn't make any money off of it. The other thing that was attached to this was the Mortgage Act, and this is going to be expanded, but it was looking at initially trying to help farmers refinance their mortgages. And like I said, this is going to get, this is specifically for farm mortgages. There's going to be a separate one for suburban households later. And this one is just targeting that. And they're going to expand on it anyways, because it wasn't fully developed with the Mortgage Act. They also were looking at trying to stop foreclosures too. So it targeted both refinancing and the foreclosures of farm homes. The next one then we have is the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was looking to get jobs for men, and this was for men only, and mostly white men. A lot of the new deals did not target any type of minority whatsoever, and we'll look at the consequences of that. So you had around 250,000 young men that were put to work with this program, and it was specifically in the title conservation projects. So you have forests, dams, bridges, things like that it was looking to have them clear forests, or also keep them clean. They weren't just clear cutting, but clearing certain areas, keeping areas clean, and trails, building dams, building bridges, and things like that. And this ends up, they also restored historical sites and beaches, cleared beaches, cleaned them up. So this did actually a lot of good with public parks and really shaping areas of that we visit today. Still, a lot of those public parks and national forests are set up the way they are from the Civilian Conservation Corps. They lived in camps, and this is part of the reason it was only for men rather than just women as well, along with, of course, the assumption that women wouldn't do this kind of harder labor. But they lived in camps set up in the park, and they moved around based on wherever they were going and what projects that they were doing. The next one is the Federal Emergency Relief Act. And the Federal Emergency Relief Act was looking at public works and wages. They gave about $3 billion to payments and wages for workers who worked for the states. So part of this was infusing money back into workers and their wages. It also gave loans and grants to the states, providing relief. So, which was kind of like what Hoover had tried to do with the $300 million earlier, that just wasn't actually doled out. And here they actually, for states that were providing emergency relief, they could get loans and grants to help out, as well as, again, the whole idea of having the states be able to pay their state workers, which was an important part of not only keeping people working, but helping the state as a whole. And then these were also used to hire unemployed people for the public works programs. So this one really, like I said, targeted the states. Employment through public works, by having each state be able to not only pay state workers, but have funds for emergency relief, and have unemployment through public works and unemployment through public works. This one was really important for roads and streets. A lot of our freeways and highways, well, highways, the freeways are a little bit later, were built and repaired. So just the amount of roads that we have today, a lot of those came from this specific bill. And they did both new construction and repair. There were a lot of airfields that were built and improved on a lot of public spaces for transportation. The next one is the Farm Credit Act. And the Farm Credit Act was looking at being more specific with the mortgage plan for farms. And so they actually created a specific agency, because it was chaotic otherwise, to centralize all farm credit services. And because there were too many different banks and loans that were involved in the first one, and so they wanted a singular entity that could manage all of this. And then they refinanced. That was a little delay there. They refinanced 1/5 of all farm mortgages. And this was important for just the number of making sure that people could actually keep their farms. The next one was Truth in Securities Act. And securities are stocks and bonds. So that's what it means when it's saying securities. They were looking, this one was specifically the idea of, okay, the stock market crash. Why did it happen? How can we make sure that it doesn't? And so one of the things is that they had to make public important information about the nature of the stocks and bonds, so that people could see what was going on, as it wasn't before. The other thing that it gave was a check and balance, based on the government being able to have control of blocking the sale of misrepresented securities, as well as actually strict or stiffer punishments for criminal activity, like insider trading. That would be one of them that way. So the government had more. This was, remember, one of the things that the advisors had suggested to Roosevelt that they needed to do, is have more oversight and ability to manage the improper sale or use of stuff. The fact that you had stricter punishments was also important to prevent people from abusing the system for, let's just say, abusing sales and purchases of stock. After this one, we have the Tennessee Valley Act. Now, this one is unique too, right? You had the very first one that well, not the Emergency Banking Act, but the Economy Act, which was unique. And the Tennessee Valley one was unique because this was the only one that looked at a specific state. Whereas all the other ones were multiple states or for the nation as a whole. This actually was pushed really hard by a particular senator of Nebraska, Senator Norris of Nebraska, who had wanted for a long time a power plant on the Tennessee River. And he was able to push that through with this act. So you have a power plant on the Tennessee River, and this then used workers, right, from the Conservation Corps, which allowed for salary and stuff. That way, it was also meant to provide low-cost electric and power to people, along with, of course, employment and housing that people needed in the area. And they specifically suggested this area not only because of the location for it, but that you had a larger poverty-stricken area. And so this would provide jobs, this would provide housing, this would provide low-cost power for that. But again, it's unique because it's addressing only one state, and none of the other ones do that. After that, you have the Home Owners Loan Act, and this one was looking at, they actually utilized the Farm Credit Act. They copied that, except for this time it was for suburban homes. So you're looking at protecting the mortgages, allowing for refinancing of home mortgages. Oops. And trying to provide very low interest mortgages for 15 years fixed rate. This helped a lot of homes that people would have otherwise lost be able to keep and hold on to their home. It saved thousands of homes. So this one is the Non-Farm Mortgage Act for urban homes, right? Whereas the other one was specifically for farms. Then you had the National Industry Recovery Act. This one actually, industrial. This one ends up being deemed unconstitutional. And they're going to adjust in the second New Deal and attempt to tackle this again. This was meant to help with labor and the industry and unemployed. Specifically, this was the idea that you had to manage businesses closer. And so it said that individual industries had to come up with a list of fair prices, maximum hours of labor, and then that would be required of the businesses. So essentially, it was regulating wages, hours of labor, also unions, in a way that basically took away a lot of the freedom of the businesses. And that, like I said, this is why it was declared unconstitutional, in the fact that that government can't control businesses that much and regulate wages and everything else that way. The last one with the first New Deal that we're going to look at was the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. And this act specifically targeted the issue with insurance and the fact that people lost all their money and there wasn't any support for that. And so it insured bank deposits of up to 1,000, which doesn't sound like much now, but up to 5,000, but it was at the time, right? And they have slowly increased that. This is something we still have today, and it has been increased over time. The other thing that they did is that commercial banks were not allowed to be in the investment business. So, and this was specifically to target the fears of the stock market and the fact that the banks lost that and had done a lot with playing around the stock market. And so they said that they couldn't invest in stocks. It doesn't mean there weren't other types of investments that they could do, but it was directly because of the fear of what happened with the stock market. And then again, the importance of the bank deposits being insured is something we still have to this day. So that's the first New Deal. And the whole point of the first New Deal was a sense of trying to provide economic security, right? If you look at the different acts and what they were doing, it was to provide economic security, recovery. The next one, security. Sorry, recovery, and you did this through jobs, mortgages, keeping so that people can have their homes, and some with looking at regulation. These the idea was as quickly as possible trying to create a sense of recovery for the United States. What happens is that, so we're on 3 here, it's not enough. And the hope that this would end the Great Depression, it obviously didn't. And so the second New Deals were created, and so the first was economic recovery. I said the second one there before. The second New Deals was economic security, trying to essentially guarantee to Americans that they would be protected from unemployment and poverty. You had some of that with the jobs and the acts in the first New Deal, but this one's going to target that even more, and was, again, in response to the fact that the first New Deals hadn't brought the United States out of the Great Depression. So what we have is the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA as it was called. A lot of these were given just the shortened version of them. So you'll see this, the WPA, and the CCC for the Civilian Conservation Corps, and so on. This one was done to provide jobs, and specifically jobs in areas that were some of the first to go and seen as non-essential, essentially. There was also attached to this the National Youth Administration. And the National Youth Administration looked to give young people that were in need jobs. So that one targeted specifically teenagers to young adults that were in desperate situations and needed work. This also included jobs that I mentioned that were seen as not, initially non-essential, and so this was the Federal Arts, Theater and Writers Project was attached to this. Again, writers, theater, were some of the first to end up losing their jobs. And so this program actually employed thousands and thousands of artists, writers, plays, things like that, actors. Sorry about that, I dropped my pen. And a lot of this is why so much of the Great Depression is so well documented, because they paid artists, those who took photos, those who wrote stories about it, to go out and do their thing with the Great Depression. You have John Steinbeck was one of those people that was supported through this project. Several of the pictures that we went through last time were from this project as well. You had books that were written that were fiction. You also had books that were collaboratively written for schools, new textbooks and educational materials, as well as, again, some plays that were put on during this period. That type of aspect of it. And like I said, it was probably one of the more documented periods of time. By this period in time, obviously with new technology, it became easier and easier to document as time went on. But you have more than you would have had for sure, based on the technology and availability, because people were paid through the WPA to go back out and work. And again, it was specifically targeting those jobs that were going to take longer to come back naturally because they weren't seen as an immediate need. Then you had the Resettlement Act Administration, and the Resettlement Administration was established in order to move farmers from the Dust Bowl and sharecroppers as well. Who had basically useless land, right? Because of the Dust Bowl, a lot of people had land that was never going, or at least not for a while, was not going to be productive. And so they actually bought their land. The government bought their land and then helped move them to new land that they could start farming again. And they did this because, of course, no one was going to buy their land. You were never going to get out of that land otherwise. They also provided loans and assistance for the expensive farm equipment. So it essentially was a whole program to get farmers back up on their feet, starting over again in a new location where they actually could. Then you had the Wagner Act, and the Wagner Act was an attempt, right? So you had the National Industrial Recovery Act that was deemed unconstitutional. The Wagner Act was meant to not fully replace it, but rather address some of the issues again in a way that wouldn't be deemed unconstitutional. And they were looking again at labor protection. That was the whole purpose of the other one, through extreme control of businesses by the government. The act guaranteed the right of unions to organize, which was an important one. So again, you take it away from saying that the government can control the businesses and what they have to do, but instead allow for collective bargaining so that they could protect their rights, as well as they created the National Labor Relations Board. And this was meant to be on the lookout for disputes between unions and employers, as well as a place for anyone to complain about abuse and things like that. So they not the same as the National Industrial Recovery Act in setting up wages, but trying to still protect employees from the businesses in ways that they could. All right, so after the Wagner Act, you have, we just have a couple more. The Social Security Act. The Social Security Act obviously is going to be the foundation for Social Security that we still have today. There were a lot of disputes. This one's kind of interesting as far as the different things they wanted to do. There was Dr. Townsend. He actually, there was an initial attempt or desire, we'll say desire because they didn't follow through with it, to set up a system where retired people were given $200 a month. But the requirement was they had to spend it all in the month or you lost it. And this was very controversial, as well as there was addressed a lot of issues with, okay, you're giving people $200 a month, but they have to spend it. Could be difficult. And what if people had more, issues, economic issues one month, and if they had been able to save it, it would have been better. The idea behind it was, again, this idea of infusing money into the economy, right? This is what we talked about with the Great Depression, and part of the problem is the lack of spending. So this came about from that idea. Well, if we give money to retired people and they have to spend it, then that's going to be constantly infusing money into the economy. But nonetheless, it became problematic. Obviously, this helped start the idea of the Social Security Act, though, from that initial plan. And instead, they created the Social Security Act, which was a national program for people. There was a couple different groups. Obviously, it was retired people, older people, but it also was for survivors and unemployed. So it targeted, like I said, a couple different groups. People over 65 ended up getting $10 to $85 a month, depending on their wages before. And there was also a program with it where you could contribute to it as well. Kind of like a retirement fund. That was the idea, is if people wanted to add to the total money, then the payments that they received, once they started receiving it, would be higher. But why we have Social Security today, even though there are some issues that are talked about with it long term as we look into the future, this was set up to provide people with security for when they retired, that they wouldn't ever be fully destitute. You have the Banking Act that was set up in order to reduce the power of private bankers, and it also allowed for the sale of government oversight for the sale of bonds. And again, this was just meant to tackle the idea that private bankers had been part of the problem with the stock market, and that they were unchecked, and that this had led to the domino effect of affecting other banks that weren't doing that. And then again, more oversight for, again, that security aspect. So the Federal Reserve Board could control the sale of government bonds. And this one was, in many ways, it was, again, to check the banks to make sure this didn't happen, but it was also just meant to alleviate people's fears that this wouldn't happen again. And that's part of that idea of security. And then you have the Revenue Act. The Revenue Act was a wealth tax. And the wealth tax, which specifically increased income taxes for high income brackets, saying that they should be paying more to help out then they definitely shouldn't be paying the same amount as people who are poor. It also had the idea that incomes over $1 million were taxed up to 75%. And inheritance gifts, which again, this was largely there was a certain amount for it. Gifts and inheritances, especially, well, they were all taxed. But the more that you got, the higher the tax, which we still have inheritance and gifts taxes today. And then the last one, the Fair Labor's Standard, the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act was outlawing child labor. There were some rules already in place with industrialization, but this was a much more blanketed outlawing of child labor. It also created a minimum wage, which, you know, we still have to this day as well. Not at what it was, which was 40 cents an hour. And then you had a minimum work week. So this is going to, a maximum, not a minimum. This is going to make sure the concept of overtime and making sure that people aren't, you know, being forced to work ridiculous hours. Maximum work week. This was 40 hours. So, like I said, we're still on that. And then the concept of overtime pay. So that if you work over the 40 hours, then they're supposed to pay you overtime. And then just creating a federal standard for regulating wages and hours. And setting up that they have the ability to do so, which is important. Because it's been proven that businesses would take advantage of this if they could. So those are, again, sorry, it's a long list, but again, important to kind of think of it in terms of, if you go through and look at the list, you know, how were these, or the website that I put up that goes through these is, okay, you know, the first one is economic recovery. So how are these things specifically trying to attack economic recovery? And then how are the second New Deals attempting to provide economic security? You know, did it help? Yes and no. Say final outcome, right? Did it get us out of the Great Depression? No. Did it help? Yes, some. And how did it help? Well, you have jobs that it provided for people. It did create some feelings of security with the economy, which meant that more businesses began hiring outside of the federal programs, right? The jobs, I want to be clear, we're talking about here with the federal programs, is that you have a lot that way. Feelings of security with the economy. And that leads to then private businesses, or just businesses, because it could be public businesses too. Businesses rather than the government hiring again. So it did help with that. You do have more spending in the economy, but it wasn't enough overall. Right? It wasn't enough to get us out of the Great Depression. It wasn't enough for the entire U.S. population, because it generally ignored women and minorities. These groups were largely left out from the having the New Deals benefit in any way. You had, for African Americans, largely the New Deals did not benefit them much. either they weren't provided any opportunity to use it, or they weren't ones that were allowed to get jobs, like the Civilian Conservation Corps was not hiring black men for most of those projects. Of course, you still had racial tensions and segregation in the United States, and that impacted which areas were provided for loans for homes. Those that lived in urban areas did benefit more, but those that lived in southern rural areas rarely saw any benefits. And you had a larger population of African Americans living in southern rural areas. So in these areas, they were the ones that did not see as many benefits for mortgages, or more often than not, renters' benefits of any kind. And more importantly, some of these policies that could help them were not enforced. So while they might have been entitled to certain aspects and programs within the New Deal, because of segregation, because of racial tensions and racism in general, the local areas simply didn't follow through in providing those benefits for African Americans. So most of the New Deals didn't end up applying to them. And then you had issues for Mexican Americans, in part because there was a lot of racist sentiment towards not Mexican American. Well, it went over into Mexican Americans, but Mexican immigration. Anytime there was an economic issue, it's not surprising that it gets targeted to the idea that there was an argument. They argued that Mexicans were taking American jobs. And so there ended up being a huge push for deportation. But the problem with this, well, there was a couple of things. One was that they would round up large groups of people, and they ended up deporting many American citizens, some who were not able to get back into the United States. And then the other issue is that labor for agriculture work was largely done by not only Mexican Americans, but also immigrants. And it was this allowed for worse payment, allowed for lower wages, and poor treatment, as well as general racism as a whole. And then you have specific racism because of this anti-immigration towards Mexican Americans, essentially being treated as Mexicans, as non-American citizens. They also were often denied a lot of services. As far as women, a lot of the New Deals didn't go for them as well. You have, there were some assumptions for women that the New Deals, kind of like with the jobs and what we looked at there, right, that the New Deals, they would benefit men, right, who were either husbands or fathers. And so therefore, women would be benefited because their husband or father would benefit, and which was not the case, right? It ignored widowed, just like the whole thing with jobs, and single women. In this process, the jobs were not for women, and even some of the other programs had that expectation that there was supposed to be a man within that process. And so Eleanor Roosevelt was a champion for women during this time and pushed and promoted for some changes to include women, but it was few and far between. So did this get us out of the Great Depression? No, it did not. The World War II, the start of World War II is what got us out of the Great Depression. These did help. It did provide some relief. You were seeing slow change. So there's always the question of, like, would this eventually have worked? Maybe, probably not. It was slow. It had been a significant increase in help and then was starting to decline. Nonetheless, World War II happens, and while we try to stay out of World War II, just like World War I, we were sending over weapons and aid and money and support, and this is going to increase production for the war effort. And this is going to then essentially be the massive spike in money and jobs that you need to get out of the Depression. It's only because of the mass federal spending for the war industry that ends up allowing that. And you have it where it impacts everyone, because you have either those for soldiers, or you have the factory. So you have the soldiers and military spending. And then on top of that, you have the factory work for production. And there were more jobs than they had people to fill. And this is then what kicks the U.S. out of the Depression and creates, we'll see at the end of World War II, another spike, just like the end of World War I, in the economy. That World War II gets out of the Depression, and by the end of World War II, you have a huge spike in the overall wealth and living conditions of people because of this mass spending and jobs that take place. So we'll look at that when we talk about World War II. So that's it with the New Deals. Again, a ton of acts and programs that were created during this period, all with that intent of trying to address what had been wrong with the economy and the situation that had got into that. But then again, the second New Deal was also looking at long term of how to have people feel secure that this wouldn't happen again.